we are very happy to have Professor John Doyle from Caltech giving the next talk over here today. And Professor Doyle has a very long and illustrious career, and he's a role model. I know of him from my first year of control theory class, where his name was mentioned. So he has done a lot of work, produced a lot of students, and we are very happy to hear from him.
Just don't believe all the stuff you hear about.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to do this very pretentious title. And this is potentially, I'll try to explain this, why this is possibly the worst talk I've ever given, but we'll see, right? I haven't given it yet. But. So here's what I'm going to talk about is this idea of this a universal layered architecture. And where is this? Well, it's everywhere, okay? Very bold claim. And why do we do it? Because we want to create diversity-enabled sweet spots. So this is the most important idea in the talk. And how do we do it? Layers, levels, laws. You've heard of these things. I'm just going to try to put them together in a way that, you know, in most domains, they're already done this way. So if you go to the internet or biology or whatever, but they don't use a common language. I'm going to try to establish a universal language that would apply. In this case, I'm going to do a few case studies. Okay. The laws, there's new laws here that aren't from physics, and we're going to talk about. And then the cartoons are bow tie and hourglass. I'm probably going to overdo this because I'm trying to get a simple picture. And then one of the big principles is constraints to deconstrain. So that's what a protocol is. It's a constraint to deconstrain. The danger is fragility and hijacking. I'll try to talk about that. And the challenge is all of this stuff is hidden in operation and quite cryptic. So you know, we're running Zoom here. All these people are sitting on Zoom. They have no idea how the packets are getting there, and they don't need to know, and they'll never know. Okay, so the case studies I'm going to do is bacteria, internet, language, robots, and AI. Okay, I'm not going to do those. I don't have time. But the good news is she's going to do these. And so next week, next Thursday at 1 p.m., this is Eastern time, Carmen will give this lecture. And so everything I'm going to tell you is very strongly influenced by Carmen, okay? So what I'm going to tell you is what Carmen learned about before she did this work. And I'll say a little bit about it. But I'm going to I would do an extremely pale imitation of Carmen. So just go watch this and you'll actually get a good talk, as opposed to what I'm going to do. Okay, so what she's going to talk about is, you can sort of read this, you know, LLMs and trajectory planning. You want to control the trajectory of tokens in embedding space. It's a lot of so humans, AI. Okay, so she's interested in both how we can use language more effectively and be more robust and more controllable in our interactions with the AIs, but also particularly robots. But also how does our brain do the same thing? Okay, so that's a lot of work. If you know Terry Sanowski around here, this is all work with Terry. Okay, so that's one of our main collaborators on that stuff. And so again, I'm not going to talk about that today. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you what a bow tie and hourglass is and why you should care. And I gave a talk in November in this thing called, the Rockwood Memorial Lecture. Okay, and I'm like a complete outlier. This thing is like who's who in AI and neuroscience. And so then there was like, you know, some crazy outlier mathematician. Anyway, another pretentious title, but I'm not going to talk about brains today. Okay. And if you're interested in brains, and this is actually a good talk. So today is going to be awful. And I apologize in advance, but this is actually, I think I'm happy about this talk. This talk is actually okay. Because I didn't try to do too much. Okay, so one of my huge heroes is Nick Lane. He's my favorite writer, any genre, anytime, anywhere. And so these are two of his older books. So, but he talks about evolution, and these are familiar ones, okay? Well, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk about life descending, starting with bacteria, and then, you know, skip, and then we get language, we get internet, robots, and AI. Okay. And so the point is, this is kind of downhill. And I'll say why. And the point is, one of the things I'm not going to do is I'm not going to tell you how amazing bacteria are. how they're incredibly intelligent. I'm going to just tell you how they do it. And so the problem is all the ways bacteria are amazing would take a whole course. Okay. So the problem though is that I'm doing a 10-week course on this topic right now at Caltech. I moved here, so I'm doing it remotely. I live across the street and here in La Jolla, and I'm retiring in May. So this is my last hurrah. So I'm trying to tell everybody at Caltech, like as I leave, what the most important ideas are here. And so that's a 10-week course, and I just decide, oh, well, I'll just cram it into 45 minutes. Okay, well, it turns out that doesn't work. Did you know that? You just can't do that. It doesn't. Anyway, okay. So this is drawn a bit from this paper, which is about 20 years ago, on bow ties, metabolism, and disease. And I'm not going to go through this, but what we're talking about is all these metabolic diseases and how the architecture of metabolism almost inevitably leads to these unless you're very careful, right? Now, you can avoid these if you're very careful, but you have to really do everything right. You have to eat right, you have to exercise, you have to do all sorts of things. Okay, so we're not going to do that. What's interesting is a meeting coming up in May 16th, what I'm really excited about human origins and modern diseases. And these are all the things they're going to go through, these are all evolutionary stages for humans. And then they're going to talk about what a nightmare that is in a modern environment. So these are, and we claim these aren't accidents. This is the inevitable consequences of just hard constraints and trade-offs. But I'm not going to talk about it. So this is the paper. This is an awful paper. But it's about as good as we can do now. So we need help, right? And the only reason this is any good at all is because the first two authors kind of did most of it, and they didn't let me wreck it too much. But this is a Control Systems magazine, and this is if you want to read one thing to try to get started, it's not so much this paper, but all the citations in it. So we're going to look at this picture, which is a truly horrible picture. And I just don't know what to do better. So again, if you know how bacteria work and look at this picture, you go, oh, I can do way better than that. Please do. So I'm going to try to explain this picture because this is basically every cell on the planet works like this, but it started with bacteria. And so there's a metabolic bow tie and there's a control hourglass. And those are the two elements you need to understand in order to understand both architecture, but any kind of intelligence. So this is the how. This is how they do. But what do? Well, they're robust, efficient, adaptable, and evolvable. Super in all of these categories. So in some sense, collectively, they're really brilliant. And they're like, basically 100% of the cells on the planet are bacterial. I mean, it's really like 99.99, it's some ridiculous number. Okay. Now for biomass, not so much. They're about 40% of the biomass. Because eukaryotes have these big honking cells and you can make trees that are huge and stuff like that. Okay, so these are the things this is why you need this architecture. Okay, you need these things, and the point is, we can now theoretically see why these things are necessary if you want these features. They're not evolutionary accidents; they're necessities. So the bow tie, this is the bow ties, glycolysis. So huge variety of nutrients come in, a huge diversity of products, huge on both ends. No diversity here, either within a cell or on the whole planet. Everybody does it the same way, and it's quite thin knot. So huge diversity, no diversity, huge diversity. Okay. And so this is both, in this case, it's fairly simple, but in general, this isn't simple. This is not a complexity bow tie. It's a diversity bow tie. And it's being able to take anything that has a positive redox status and eat it and produce all the huge number of macromolecules that you need for a cell. So it's the need to take diverse nutrients and produce diverse products. And this is the only way it'll work. This is the only scalable, robust way to make it work. Okay. And then everything in our world works like this. The internet works like this, the power grid works like this, everything works like this. Okay, so it's diversity, not complexity. It doesn't mean this is simple. It just means it's universal. Internet, right? Huge, all sorts of data, right? All sorts of kinds, all sorts of data, huge diversity. They all get turned into packets. This is kind of a trivial observation. But the first people who thought of this were geniuses. Yeah.
So from a capitalism point of view, why is there diversity in the output?
Because you got to, I mean, if you look across the bacterial biosphere, everybody that uses this, how many proteins get made? Basically an infinite number. Okay. So there's 10 to the 30th cells. They're not all the same, but there's a lot of diversity within the cells. And then what the cells do is make, tens of thousands of proteins. Every gene basically makes a protein. So we have 20,000 genes. We make way more than 20,000 proteins, but the basic protein is 20,000. So that's why this is so diverse. Okay. So here's the internet, same thing. Now, when this was first proposed, all the Bell Labs, Shannon crowd said, this is crazy. You can't build anything like this. And of course, now even the phone system runs on this, right? So that was an interesting battle. And what's interesting was the people who came up with this idea for the internet, many decades ago were really artistic geniuses, but they had no theory. So the internet just kept crashing and crashing and crashing and every time they'd crash, it'd pick. So at this time, nobody was using it, right? Or only academics were using it, say in the 80s. And then finally in, the 2000s, we actually had a theory for why you should do it this way. Okay. Language, right? How many words do we have? Maybe 10,000 words. I don't know. I probably have less. You probably have more. And I'm trying to communicate to you. So my words to your words. But there's only about 40 phonemes. So I'm only producing about 40 phonemes. Okay. Same with the words. How many sentences? Well, where's infinite? I mean, it basically is infinite here. And there's infinite here. And there's certainly less than 100,000 words, probably less than 10,000. Again, so you see this everywhere, and you have to do this. Imagine without this. Imagine what you would do if somehow we had, we just had a bunch of tokens in order, and that's what we were just sending around to each other. And this was not, 10,000, but it was this big, right? Okay. And then, so these nests, right? So you start with sentences and down to words and the phonemes and back out, right? So you get nested bow ties. This is I just try to use this, which is level zoom, which is you zoom in, you zoom in, you zoom in, layers stack and stages flow. And so this just says, you zoom in on the sentence, you get the word and you get phonemes. This is like really bad. We'll do better ones, right? So, okay, so we get this diversity bow tie. Okay, so again, let's go back to this, right? And so that's this part of this picture. Now we're trying to take something that's like in 100 dimensions and plot it in 2. Right? So we're going to say, okay, we're going to try 3 dimensions and project it into 2. So this is supposed to be 3-dimensional. This is supposed to be coming out of the board, and this is supposed to be in the board. You got to use your imagination. Okay. And so what's in the middle? It's something like this, right? And so what this is it's got lots of feedback, which is controlled and autocatalytic. And if you want to read about this is a science paper from, I don't know, 2013 or something. Like anyway, more than a decade ago. And what this explains is why are there glycolytic oscillations in yeast? Complete mess. And this cleared it up. Okay. So, but where does this sit? Well, so again, every cell you break things down and you make all these things. And again, there's basically an infinite list of these. And then these get turned into proteins and DNA and stuff like that. Okay. Very diverse on both sides. So what if you didn't have a bow tie architecture? Well, everybody has to connect to everything, right? So that's what inside every cell would be, and that's a nightmare. We build some technologies like this, and then they break, and then we switch to a bow tie. So this is robust, efficient, adaptable, evolvable. And so the point is,
like an example. technology.
I would say, that's a good discussion. That will,
Academia.
well, academics like this, yeah. Oh yeah, there's a lot of examples. I have to think, what's my favorite example?
Yeah.
I'll have to think, I'll think, well, I'll get my favorite example. So point is, this is necessary if you want these features. That sits here, right? And these are enzymatically catalyzed reactions. And so that's the sort of forward path that you typically see. And there's like, I don't know, that many proteins in every E. coli cell, right? So there's a lot of, so that's what they make a lot of proteins. Now, these are not all different, right? There's maybe 2,000 or 5,000 different proteins, but there's a total large number of them. And each one's like a little oscillator, which I'm not going to go into. But so here's what happens. You make ATP, you send it to the rest of the cell, but you have to feed it back. So this is autocatalytic and it's destabilizing. It's like gravity's destabilizing, right? Right? But we can control it if it doesn't get too short, right? And then you get like this and it gets harder and harder and eventually you can't do it at all. So if you don't keep this, so what the cell does is make sure it's like this. That's what the cell is like. So it oscillates a little bit, but not a lot. But in extracts, graduate students can take this same thing and put it in this regime, and which is completely unnatural, but it's what people think is kind of real. So we clarified that. Said, this doesn't happen in cells, does it? And they go, yeah, that's true. We always assumed it would. Anyway. Okay, so here's all the constraints that you need to satisfy. These are all conserved quantities, globally conserved quantities. And so what you need to do is have all this conserve everything. So here's this picture. So you may have seen a picture like this about what metabolism looks like. And that's this part of the picture. So what you never will see is this stuff, because what would this look like if you put the feedbacks in? It would just be black with lines. And that's true in all of biology. Nobody ever draws the feedback. Of course, they don't understand it very well. And you just can't draw it. You can't draw it. So what you need is a layered way of looking at it, right? You can't just do it in one layer and one level, right? You need to have a way of decomposing it in a way that maintains some coherence of it. But also I'm claiming that this thing is actually quite universal. So we don't have this mess, okay? But we have a mess. But this mess has architecture and you can make sense of it all, right? Whereas this would be hopeless and also it wouldn't work. But these are totally different. This is counterfactual and impossible, and this is actual and necessary. Okay, so these are very, very different pictures. Same with like primate visual cortex. So what you have is that you have this forward path from the retina to the motor system. And then the feedbacks are like 10 times as many. So you have 10 times as many wires going back actually out to LGN as is coming. So this is 10 times more than this. And this is LGN. I don't put LGN number. Okay. Been a total this is so confusing neuroscientists. So they all got these ideas of predictive coding and they sort of think it's all big Kalman filter, basically, which it is kind of. But the reason you have to do this is slow. And if this is slow, you've got to do this. And if you want to know about that, ask me about it, why you have to do this. Okay. So this complexity is necessary. Okay, so let me see this again. So what can go wrong? Well, one of the things about this, which is that this is all swappable. So this is all metabolites, right? And so since everybody's running the same architecture, you can swap metabolites. So you can build this enormous bacterial biosphere. It's all completely connected through sharing a metabolite, okay? The problem is, and I'm going through this obviously really fast. Parasites and predators can hijack this. So they're not sharing, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Well, this is sort of some new things. So so there's this control hourglass now, and this has stages, okay? And then, so we talk about the metabolic bow tie, I want to talk about the control hourglass. So that's up top here. And I'm leaving out this massive autocatalytic feedback. So there's massive autocatalytic feedback here, black with lines. We put the autocatalytic feedback here, black with lines. So we can break it up and find out what that does, but it's you can't draw it. So this is the hourglass. You got diverse genes, you have transcription, translation, that makes diverse proteins, and then those proteins run the bow tie below. Diverse genes, diverse enzymes, but this transcription translation is universal. Now, the actual enzymes that do that are universal, but every cell on the planet that has this does it the same way. So actually, a lot of cells in our body don't have this because they throw it away, like red blood cells and platelets. But this is uniform and universal, both every cell in your body, every cell on the planet, except for those that jettison this in later stages of development. Okay, so if you didn't have this, again, it would be this would just be a mess. Okay. But you have this hourglass and it's necessary. Okay. So you got this and this, which are these bow ties and hourglasses. And what that means is that because everybody does it the same way, you can swap metabolites and you can swap genes. So bacteria can swap genes like crazy, right? If we could do this, I would not look like this, okay? I would look like Michael Jordan, but not that Michael Jordan. Sorry, the other Michael, the basketball player. Okay, so that's not swappable, and that's not swappable. And the point is, if you want all this stuff to be swappable, you have to be running the same operating system, right? Okay, so this part is uniform and universal, and then the code and metabolites are not. Right? So huge diversity there and all swappable. Okay, and this is what I mean by the constraints of deconstrain. Once you decide that you're going to constrain yourself with this, then all of a sudden you have this enormous diversity that you can support. So it's a constraint that deconstrains. I love that phrase. I mean, Gerhard and Kirchner are two of the best system biologists there are, and so love this. So what can go wrong, right? This is perfect. It's perfect, okay? You have to do it this way. So what is the consequences of all these things? Like what goes wrong? Okay. Well, there's phage. These little guys, okay? And basically these are a bacterial internet. So the idea is what you can do, what bacteria can do is they can take DNA and they can package it up in one of these things. This thing can go out into the environment, travel around in the environment, and then give that DNA to a new bacteria. Fabulous. So it is really the first internet. So, and phage have their own architectures and trade-offs and so on, okay. But it can greatly accelerate horizontal gene transfer and evolution. So this was one of the great inventions of bacteria, was creating this internet. Unfortunately, it evolved to be killer pathogens. Like what could go wrong, right? And they kill 20 to 50% of the ocean bacteria every day. So they went from being this great internet to being this killing machine. And who decides on 50%? I think it's the phage, because like you can't kill all your hosts. So what's the optimal number of hosts to kill a day to maximize your production? About half. If you kill 100%, you're dead, right? And if you kill 0, you don't grow. Anyway, I don't really know if this is optimal, but this kind of hijacking is a universal fragility of these architectures. Good thing that nothing like this happens in our world. Like the internet is probably, pristine and perfect, just like this was originally. So none of this could have happened, right? I mean, we just don't have to worry about these things. Okay, so, okay, this is where it gets really messy. Yeah.
Is the byproduct of this architecture of multi and hourglass, or?
Well, it's certainly an innovation. So once you have this architecture, then an innovation you can do is build an internet on. which is what the phage. The phage are the packets of that internet. Okay. And that's just a feature that you now can do, right? And then, what goes wrong? Well, the phage go rogue, and they become, in some sense, the dominant life form. And so it's just an example of how you can make a perfect architecture, and it gets hijacked. Even the mechanisms you create get hijacked. And again, like I'm saying, nothing like that happens. Okay.
They aren't phages the dominant?
What?
Phages are the dominant.
They are the dominant life form on the planet. But nothing like that would happen with our internet, because our internet is so, doesn't have any hijacking, doesn't have any data. Right? Okay, so here's the worst. I'm only showing you these pictures because I don't know how to draw these pictures. Okay, so here is the central dogma. DNA, RNA, protein with a little, replication, transcription, translation, and then you've got this metabolism down. And these are all bow ties with flows. Okay. But a huge diversity here, right? Lots of diversity, lots of diversity, lots of diversity. So these are stages, okay? They flow from left to right, and they're all bow tied, okay? Okay, so that's the picture, stages flow, okay. These are all the hourglasses. Actually, I've only drawn a tiny fraction of them, but they're everywhere, right? That turns out. And so the picture gets really ugly. And then, so the layers stack, okay? So we got this picture, and then you try to put this on top of it, and okay. You really can't draw it, right? So I apologize, but so the question is, how do we take these architectures, which we really have a deep understanding of how the bacteria does this. We have a deep understanding of how the internet does this. How can we make a picture that will explain this to somebody who doesn't already know? So if you don't actually know how bacteria work, this is just a mess. Okay, so I got to figure that. So it's unreadable mess. Okay, let's do language. How are we doing on time? How much? Oh, wow. Okay. I'm like 10% through. Anyway, I knew this is hopeless. Let's jump ahead to language. Okay. The function of language is communication for decision and control between and within agents. Let's just say that's what language is. So what's the function? Okay. So what are the constraints? Just what the hardware is available. Okay. So here are the layers. Semantic, syntax, phonology. Okay. This is like apps, OS, hardware, sort of. Okay. So this idea is due to Jackendorf, who was actually a student of Chomsky, but this is a severe departure from Chomsky. It hasn't caught on the way it should have. So one of the things that Carmen is trying to do is really create a solid theoretical foundation for linguistics that would replace Chomsky, which is that's a nightmare, by the way. Okay. But then there's stages. Let's suppose we say the function is comms for decision and control. So there's levels, so levels and layers are orthogonal to each other. So you take this phrase, right, and you look at the words. So this is a level. This is phrase level, word level, and you zoom in, right? So this is this thing, and then you zoom in and you see these things, and then you zoom in further and you see the letter. So you zoom, you zoom, you zoom. Here you stack. These are stacked on top of each other. So layer stack, levels zoom. Okay. So that's how this comes out as letters, right? At this bottom case. Okay. And again, there's bow ties and hourglasses all over here, right? So this idea from Jackendorf got crystallized, I would say, before. I mean, ULA is about 20 years old, and Jackendorf was before that. So you should get. So this isn't me applying this stuff. This is just telling you what Jackendorf came up with independently And I don't think he likes this because he doesn't want to be a special case of something, right? I mean, nobody wants to be a special case of something, right? So I think, okay, so but the point is, here's the crucial thing about this architecture. If you take the phrase, it has semantics, it also has syntax, and it also has phonology, okay? And then you take the word and it has all these things. Now the letters really don't have them very strongly, okay? But what this means is that a word has a semantic meaning that then by a syntax is put together into a phrase that has new meaning beyond the words. But the words have meaning and they have a syntactic role. So these two things are very intertwined, and that's typical of an architecture. The problem is when I tried to draw it for the bacteria, it was just like, oh, okay, this is my best picture of an intertwined layers and levels. This is very powerful. It does allow for recursion, which is very powerful. But the heart of this isn't merge. That's kind of a benefit of doing it this way. The heart of this is that these orthogonal layers and levels are perfectly designed to learn from examples. And it had to be for, hundreds of thousands of years. Children learn from examples. Now machines do. So, but you're constrained by the hardware. So we could spend the whole time talking about how this is constrained by having to run it on this hardware. So, but there's more levels. So this is another level picture, right? So you zoom, 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 zoom. But zoom isn't just scale. You zoom on a scale, you zoom, you zoom, you zoom, and then you see some new structure. That's a level. Okay. So these are the units of zooming, and these are the things you find there in the brain. Okay, and Terry's this is like he did this 100 years ago. Okay, so he's been out ahead of this for a long time, and he's my main collaborator on all this stuff now. One of the reasons I moved away. But in learning from examples, the architecture of language is more important than the architecture of the brain and the machines that learn. Because the architecture of language was constrained by brains. And you can make a machine that's nothing like a brain, but if it has any of the capabilities of a brain, it's going to learn this. But it's not because of the hardware. It's not because you're running, LLMs on GPUs. It's because this architecture is learnable from examples. I mean, this is all Carmen's idea, okay? But I'm very excited about this. And so the idea is that there's simple languages already in other organisms, particularly other hunters, okay? But then we could do it with learning and teamwork, right? And now this is what we do today. And so what could go wrong, right? Well, writing was invented around then, and I think it let them do these things. I mean, I don't know about you, but because I'm not a religious believer in the Egyptian, nor actually most of those, there's a lot of religions around then. You can't decide between them, right? And they constantly like fighting wars and stuff like that. And you go, why don't you just stop fighting, right? Anyway, so I don't think you would have been able to do this without writing. And I think this is kind of a waste of labor and materials, but I don't believe in this religion. But huge wars because you could now organize much bigger empires. Printing press, great invention, right? The century after the printing press was one of the most bloody things in Europe. Because now you could fight over like words in the Bible. You think it's one thing, I think it's another thing. We fight to the death until one of us has killed all the rest of it, right? So there's things can go wrong, right? Of course, the good thing is there's nothing like this going on. Then the radio, right? Extreme horrors, right? Again, nothing like this now. Oh, shit, okay. I guess there are some stuff happening now. You can't even tell which part of the world this is in. This could be LA. Right? I don't even know where it is. I think it's Ukraine, but it certainly could be Gaza. You can't, where is this, right? Anywhere in the world is gonna be. Where is this? Everywhere in the world, right? Where is this? I mean, anyway. So I guess things aren't so perfect as I hoped. So like it's all better now, yeah. Okay, so the best examples of this architecture are, in fact, bacteria. And actually our cell phones are pretty good too. You've got apps, operating system, hardware, huge diversity, moderate diversity, no diversity, okay? So the point is this is not metaphorical in the sense that if you do the math, it's all the same math. So let's take an oversimplified view of the internet. I'm going to go, since you know this, I'm going to go through this really fast. So suppose you're doing Zoom, then you got these 3 layers, right? And this is all software, and this is hardware. And that was what Turing's genius was to say, hey, let's separate these 2 things, right? So diverse apps, huge diversity of apps, right? We all running all sorts of huge diversity of hardware. That's a terrible picture. Anyway, diverse hardware. And so you got these, so everything runs on everything, right? Nightmare. Right? Well, it doesn't quite do that. So what's in the middle is an OS. Now notice that this OS isn't simple, right? So diverse swapping, okay? Again, what can go wrong? But okay, so there's an OS in the middle. And the OS is uniform everywhere. Everybody more or less runs the same OS, either on TCP/IP, but it's usually some version of Linux. I mean, we call it other things, but okay. So pretty much pretty uniform, totally diverse, okay. So, but it's not simple, it's complex. So let's just take a look. This is just Linux kernel now, right? So it's layers and levels all the way down, right? You keep seeing this all the way down, right? Layers, levels all the way down, okay? And so that all has to squeeze the little box on my PowerPoint slide, right? So kind of a cheat, right? But how do you draw this, right? And so you got diverse data, diverse things. So now you see, you've got this hourglass, but now you see the bow ties intertwined with it. You just can't draw them both together. I've been trying to, so you've got, again, you got packets. And so the idea is that in this case, they're basically the same, but here they're quite different. Okay, so, but all of this is completely virtualized. So you don't see any of this, right? That's what makes it hard. This is in your body too, and you don't see that. But it's all virtualized. And virtualization is not abstraction. Virtualization is what the world does. Abstraction is what we do with that. Okay. Okay, so it's the same story. Okay, so I'll try to end with this. This is, I just threw this in here. This is a picture that Terry and Carmen made. Terry Sanowski and Carmen Alonso, okay. Or it wasn't quite like this. And I said, no, you're not, okay, so this is my attempt. Apologies to them, okay. So this is kind of a way of thinking about both what robots have to do and what humans have to do. And they want to think about it in a very integrated way, okay. So you have sensing, you got the world, you sense the world, and you do some estimation, and you then use attention, and these are layered. And then you have this embedding space, and then you have long-term working memory, and then you have long-term memory, and then you have short-term memory. And so I don't understand what's in these boxes. Terry does. This is good, so I don't have to. I can just look at the boxes, right? Okay. And then, of course, stages and layers, and apologies. And then, of course, then there's tons of feedback. So you can't put the feedback in because it would just be black with lines. So you never draw the feedback. And that's been a real, I think that's been the major problems with neuroscience, is they've not focused on delays. They think like Shannon, not like Turing and Bodie. And they just kind of ignore this. Even though it's like all the wires are feedback. And then there's these little trickle of things going the other way, which is the forward path. Okay. So if you want to go see about this, go listen to Carmen like next week. Because she actually understands what this stuff. I'm just kind of mimicking it. And it fits into my theory framework, which of course she learned first. So she learned that and then said, oh, I want to go work on language. I go, that's insane. Language is impossible. It's a nightmare. It's as bad as the 70s in control theory. She goes, yeah, what did you do in the 70s? Okay, that's a good point. Okay, so, and one of the things, here's one of the things that's really hard to understand. I'm the only person in this room that, so, I started doing research in this, in control theory 50 years ago. I remember a time when robustness was not studied at all. One thing, right? And the other thing was, there was no Steve Boyd. Can you imagine what a nightmare research is when nobody knows what a condition number is, nobody thinks about robustness, and there's no Steve Boyd for you just to go, hey, Steve, can you solve this problem, right? So I was actually working on, in the 70s, I was actually working on optimization. It's a hard subject, right? So I'm really glad that, Steve Boyd came along and then my students were so much smarter than me. And so they kind of did a lot to advance this stuff. So I don't work on optimization anymore, not because I don't think it's important. It's just that there's so many people that are better than me. So, but I just want to, well, you can't, the thing is, you can't imagine what a dark age is that way. Anyway, so go see Carmen and we have time for questions.